All right, it looks like we're live with the newest episode of We the Individuals, where we each believe in the novel proposal that we each choose our own manner of being governed. I think I added an extra we each end there, but that's okay. Tonight we have with us one fewer people than we normally have on. We have, as usual, Jeff Peterson II, the co-founder of We the Individuals. And our guest today is Christopher Chase Rachel, somebody that has enough notoriety in the libertarian community that many of you may know who he is. He is the esteemed author of the book A Spontaneous Order, which Jeff and I have both read. Just to give a little brag on this book, and I'm going to let Chase describe it to us, but this is a self-published book that in the past, however many months it's been, 4 or 5 months, right, since it's been published, has sold over
Since
11,
June. Yeah.
how many?
Since June.
So since June, he sold over 1,100 copies of this book for a self-publication. That is actually nothing short of phenomenal, especially for somebody's inaugural work. I read it over the summer. It was fantastic. We're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about some of the other activities you've had going on in your town of Asheville for the past few years. But to start off, Chase, just give us a little overview of the book, why you wrote it, and what you're trying to accomplish with it.
Sure. Yeah, well, a spontaneous order is essentially a very compact, concise, and comprehensive case for anarcho-capitalism. Pretty much the first part of it is dedicated towards providing the theoretical foundations, the justifying the core principles of libertarianism or anarcho-capitalism. So, for instance, it starts off with epistemology and praxeology, which is pretty much the foundation of anything. And then it goes into justifying, not just claiming on face value, but actually providing a rational proof via argumentation ethics for VIP and self-ownership. Then it goes into talking about what is property, what isn't property, and then it talks about contract theory, money and banking, monopolies and cartels, insurance.
Well, let me jump in actually, because I want to ask you about the because you provide a very thorough case about all the different areas. But before I'm going to pick your brain on a few of these, get you to demonstrate your ability to talk about it on the fly. But let's start with the first two chapters, which for those of you who haven't had the book, that's actually chapters 0 and 1. Epistemology and praxeology is not written by you. It's written by one of your friends. What's his name again?
It's Will Porter.
Will Porter, and then libertarianism is the first chapter, is the second chapter, which is chapter 1. And that, as I read it, kind of provided the foundation for your theoretical basis for all of the following chapters, correct?
Yes.
Describe the logical foundation for those, if you can, for us.
Yeah, well, like you said, Will's he's the only other author who contributed to the book, other than
Kinsella
who
wrote the foreword.
Yeah, the foreword. But Will went ahead and talked about the Austrian method, if you will, praxeology. He described why economics is unique from other natural sciences and why it doesn't rely upon empirical data in order to extrapolate economic principles, if you will. And that's a very foundational thing, because this is what really separates and distinguishes Austrian economics from other schools of economics, like Keynesian economics or Chicago School even. And it's also a kind of esoteric topic, so I think it'd be a good thing for people to actually look into and read about, and it's written in a very accessible way. That was our biggest goal, was to make it as solid of an explanation as possible and not compromise the integrity of the importance of it, what it stood for, but at the same time make it accessible enough so that any somewhat intelligent layman can absorb it. And then chapter 1, like I briefly mentioned before, I wanted to describe and define what exactly libertarianism is, at least from an anarcho-capitalist perspective, and not only to say what it is, but also to provide a proof for its core foundational principles. And so in this chapter, I provide a rational proof for the private property ethic, for non-aggression principle, self-ownership. The private property ethic is pretty much just telling us, that any scarce goods are subject to ownership given they are acquired via original appropriation or homesteading, involuntary exchange. I use Hoppe's argumentation ethics to accomplish this, but unlike Hoppe, again, I try to really spell out this argumentation ethics method for proving these principles and make them much more accessible to the layman. So that's really the theme for the whole book, is bringing the very rigorous and advanced arguments from all the greatest scholars in the field of libertarian legal theory or Austrian economics, and make them very accessible to the layman, so I can bridge the gap from the layman to the scholar, so that everyone can be privy to these arguments against some of the most sophisticated objections to the kind of ideas and principles that we like to tout.
Now, one of the things, I actually didn't mention this beforehand, but I actually had the pleasure of visiting Chase and his beautiful family just this past week. He let me sleep on his couch while I was, Andy, I'm glad you're on, because what I was going to say is I was on my way to an economics conference where I presented a paper on Josiah Warren, your favorite person to take a drink when I mention his name, and we got it. I think we stayed up till like 1 in the morning talking about, you know, boys and painting our fingernails and talking about, you know, Hoppe's argumentation ethic, right? I mean, that's what people do at slumber parties, is they talk about libertarian theory. And the reason I wanted to bring up these two chapters is we got into a pretty long conversation about this. So in the epistemology and praxeology that Will wrote, you're basically setting the economic foundation, the logical foundation for Austrian economics, and in the libertarian chapter, you're setting the moral foundation, and you really are synthesizing those two in this book. Am I correct in saying that?
Oh, you're absolutely right. And to me, you know, ultimately, I like to think of myself as a deontological libertarian. However, I know that most people aren't going to be convinced by just either the moral or just the utilitarian argument alone. So I really wanted to bring out the arguments from both sides of the utilitarian and the ethical side of the perspective. So yes, I do try to synthesize both of those, because I think, you know, we may as well, since we're pretty much making comprehensive case. I don't want it just to be I want it to be more of a broad book that anyone can reference to point to any. And it's separated by topics, right? So it's separated by environmentalism, law and order, security, domestic security. So basically anything that the most common objection would be, you can kind of flip to the chapter. It's like a great reference. And I want people to have both sides of the argument, the ethical and the consequential.
Now, out of these, which do you think is the most common objection you get on anarcho-capitalism?
Oh man, well, it really depends on what kind of person I'm talking to. If it's like a leftist or whatever, I'm usually asked about, you know, what about the poor and the indigent? What about the big bad corporations or the monopolies? You know, things like that. So I've got chapters dedicated towards those, and it's someone who's more from the right. I usually get asked about the law and order, defense and security, and I find that intellectual property is surprisingly kind of hard to sell to both the left and the right. Usually, they seem to be.
Well, even we had a little bit of a debate about that, didn't we?
Yeah, I believe we did. Yeah. So you know, I think if you just looked at the topics, the chapters themselves, they probably address more arguments from the left that you would typically see. But you know, I just think that it's a lot easier to relate for us, for whatever reason, to these small government conservatives and to sell them these kind of ideas than you know, a socialist or leftist type who has a lot more fundamentally irreconcilable ideas about the core foundations of our philosophy, which is like private property and capitalism and free markets.
Yeah, one of the other things I like about your book, kind of bringing up, you brought up the left when you're talking about the left. After you set in chapter 0 and 1, of course, the foundations, the economic and the moral foundations. Then chapter 2, you build into property, and you're of course using the first two chapters to build into how we establish property rights and things of that nature. But that, of course, is also building in the property as it relates to all these. So you can't put property at the end of that. So you are outlining these chapters in a very logical order. You build property and then contract, and then from there you can probably mix subjects around a little bit. But you have to start, I think, with property, and that's what you've done. Now, the favorite I think topic for me to talk about with people, and we discussed this for hours, is law and order and defense and security, your chapters 8 and 9. Can you give us a little rundown of how that would work in an anarchist society according to your book?
Well, I'm gonna leave some surprise for people and get them incentive to read the chapters, because it's just so hard to do that topic justice in a little short spiel. But basically, just like any other service, whether it's producing cars or providing financial advice, or you're a PR consultant, whatever it is, just like any other service, we realize that anything we provide, whether it's food or anything, or medicine, that's provided much more efficiently through the market. And that whenever you have the government come in and monopolize a service, or to at least regulate a service, and to cause it to deviate and to be insulated from market pressures, then you tend to decrease the quality of whatever's provided and increase the cost. And there's also invisible costs, which is whatever else what other methods could have been developed, or what other products or services could have been developed absent that state interference. So law and order and defense and security is absolutely no different. If you have one institution which has the monopoly on these services, the government, and furthermore, that you're forced to pay for these services, well, there's going to be a moral hazard, right? It's going to tend to be the quality of the service goes down, and the cost continues to rise, because what incentive do these people have to really provide a good service so they're not competing with anyone? And yes, we know that they have some superficial token oversight, and they have their own kind of mechanism for that, but ultimately that's just pales in comparison to the uncompromising and indiscriminate market pressures, right? So go ahead. I'm just saying that I just break it down, and those chapters leave more of a practical utilitarian argument, because I know that even people who are fond of the idea of having a privatized or free market police force or judicial system, even those people who want to believe are sometimes hesitant to, because they just don't see how it could practically function. So I really do spend more time in the practical aspect, but I obviously do show the ethical point of view as well.
Right. Now, when an anarchist looks at your table of contents and they see that word law in there, and of course you're going to have some anarchists say, well, we're anarchists, we don't believe in law, and there it is right there, a chapter in your book. What's your response to that?
well, again, it's like there's some grounds that they use to oppose the state. Like, on what grounds are they opposing the state? They think that there's some fundamental injustice by the state, right? And whatever that source of injustice is something that they essentially want to oppose and prohibit, if you will, to outlaw, whether it's some fuzzy notion of exploitation, or if it's a more concrete notion like we have of aggression. There's some type of behavior or activity that they are opposing. And the only thing a law says is that, look, we view this type of activity to be destructive to the foundations of society and to be overall limiting our freedom of movement with each other and our ability to cooperate. So a law is just a mutually binding rule of conduct. Mm-hmm. So you can't really, no matter, even if you say nominally that you're against laws, well, you're not really against laws unless you truly don't care what anyone does and you truly want a might makes right paradigm. But even then, what's the law in that case? Well, the strongest rule. That's even kind of a law unto itself, so you can't really escape it. Anarchy is about no rulers, no people with legal privileges, that the law applies to all of us equally, no matter what, that we all have an equal set of, I say, negative rights.
Hmm.
And
What do you?
Go ahead,
go
Jeff.
ahead.
I was going to ask, what's your usual content? I get this question a lot because
Jeff, you're cutting out. All right.
Are you not hearing his question either?
I'm not. Okay, so I wasn't sure if that was Jeff or me. Jeff, you're cutting out. So we're gonna move on. If you get back in working order, we'll come back to that question. Um, yeah, I always like to bring that up because one of the things that I always get a good chuckle about is when I say, "Oh, we oppose laws." And it's kind of like saying we oppose corporations. We oppose what is recognizable in the current system as those things, but there is still this natural order, and that's what I think I enjoyed about your book was it does demonstrate this natural order in all these different elements of society. It really is, I think, probably the only one volume book I've read in any of this stuff. I usually is a book devoted to each thing that you have a chapter. So it's definitely worth a read, especially for people that have never had that full overview. Have you had any negative feedback about your book? I'm just curious.
The only, and I'm not just tooting my own horn here, but the only negative feedback I've ever had were from people who hadn't actually read the book and they are offended by the topic. you
I
know,
read one
so
of those Amazon reviews, actually, I remember. Is
yeah,
anarcho-capitalism, therefore I'm giving it a one-star review. Jeff, are you
exactly.
back on? Yeah. All right, we'll give him a little bit more time. We're all having some technical issues tonight. Like 5 minutes before we're on, I had to go and change the settings in my router. Now Jeff's having problems. Probably karma because he made fun of me for my problems. And I don't know where Andy popped in, and we haven't heard from him. So this might just be a one-on-one chase, and that's fine. I know we can have some good conversation. Let's move on for now. We'll come back to this topic
Sure.
if Jeff gets working properly, but. I've got to talk about some of this Asheville stuff because I mean, you saw, I was blown away by some of the stuff you were telling me when we were visiting in Asheville. For anybody that hasn't been to Asheville, North Carolina, what'd you call it, like the San Francisco of the East, or?
Yeah, they have several different names for it. They call it the San Francisco of the East, or the Paris of the South, or the New Age Mecca. It's basically, I mean, it is kind of got a somewhat leftist
Can you
disposition
guys hear me?
overall.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Okay.
we'll come back
but
to you in a second, Jeff.
what's really cool about the area is that people there are generally very willing to think outside the box.
Hmm.
And what was particularly important to me when I made when I founded the Blue Ridge Liberty Project way back when, and for this is that there are a lot of people here who are open to and supportive of peaceful parenting and homeschooling and unschooling and that sort of thing.
Sure, tell us about that a little bit because I know you're really involved in these projects as well. You're a father for one thing, so you're actively
Yes.
practicing peaceful parenting.
Yes. Well, I'm no longer affiliated with the Blue Ridge Liberty Project. Well, actually, I think it's called the Blue Ridge Liberation Project. There was a pretty significant ideological shift on part of the other co-founders' side, and also there were some internal issues about just him having unilateral control over the website and Facebook page and Facebook groups, and he was banning people for no good reasons and wasn't participating. So most of us kind of defected, if you will, from the BRLP and formed the Voluntarist Initiative because the BRLP people went very anarcho-primitivist, and most of us are very still much into the free market in that aspect. So we formed our own thing. It's really simply just a community of people who are voluntarists and supportive of peaceful parenting. They don't have to be a parent; they can be single. That's totally cool. But we wanted to create kind of a sort of enclave or sanctuary, if you will, for like minds who kind of are starving for that in-person socialization and community that otherwise they couldn't get wherever they're from, or in order to get it, they have to kind of hide significant parts of who they are. Right.
Right. Talk for a minute about peaceful parenting and how that relates to your libertarian beliefs.
Yeah, well, peaceful parenting, well, when it gets to a certain point, I mean, I think children, um, the non-aggression principle, I feel, applies to children pretty much universally. They own themselves too. They're people as well. In fact, unlike us, where we're at in our lives currently, they didn't actually choose who was their parents. They didn't choose where they live. They're kind of obliged to be with these people, right? So the least that these people who take care of them can do is to refrain from using aggression against them, right? But the point is we see peaceful parenting as not only something that's important because of the NAP in a very narrow sense, but as a very effective way to mitigate the state's legitimacy. If you raise kids in a paradigm of authoritarianism, that you should respect your elders because they're elders, you do what I say because I told you to. We're going to tell you what to think, what to read, what to believe. You teach that sort of mindset of domination. Well, then they're very primed for accepting that when they get transferred under the state's jurisdiction, if you will, when they graduate from high school. But then again, they're always under the state, right? And then you send them to public school for 12 years, then the indoctrination is just further compounded. So for us, homeschooling and peaceful parenting are essential to breaking the mental shackles, if you will, of the state, and more fundamentally the ideas of authoritarianism. Instead of being domineering, we negotiate with them, we express sympathy for their needs, we have more of a mutual relationship. That's not to say that we're not the guardians and ultimately responsible for them. It's just to say that we treat them more as fellow human beings with needs and desires and feelings, as opposed to subordinates to be whipped and trained and subjugated,
Oh, Jeffrey.
disciplined.
Jeffrey Tucker, what brings you to the conversation tonight?
Good
What a
evening.
surprise.
Nice
How are
to
you,
see you.
Jeff?
Yeah, good. I don't know if you can. My connection is seriously bad tonight. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, and you're coming in better than most of us tonight, actually.
Well, my monopolistic internet provider has decided to throttle my access for the day, so I had to rely on the quasi-private sector service of Verizon's hotspot. So,
What do you know? The private sector steps in where the government fails. So, what brings us this pleasure of having you on, Jeff?
well, I got a sweet invitation from my good friend Jeff Peterson, and I appreciate it very much.
Oh, wonderful. We're glad you can join us. We were just talking with Chase Rachels about his recent book and some of his initiatives in Asheville, North Carolina, and peaceful parenting. Do you have anything you'd like to add in the conversation before we move on?
Well, I don't know what you've been talking about, but peaceful parenting is an interesting. Is that what you said? Peaceful parenting?
Yes.
Well, I find it to be a fascinating application of principles of liberty, one that was unthinkable, say, 10 or 20 years ago. And I like it because, the first kind of power relationship we have to experience, either as parents or as children, is in families,
Mm-hmm.
and that really does test our core commitments to individualism, the idea of human dignity, and to peace and cooperation and voluntarism as a ethical idea, So I think it's an appropriate application, and I'm always celebratory of anybody who's doing that kind of work. And I think it's important work. Quite often, people want to exclude the family as, in their analysis of politics, and I don't think that's I don't think that's a good idea. I think the principle of liberty is really inclusive of many spheres of life. So I guess that's all I'll say.
All right. Wonderful. Chase, let's go back to what we were talking about as well. You came on right at the tail end of that, so we're glad to hear what you had to say about that, Jeff. But Chase, you mentioned. Well, I'll bring you up to speed. Jeffrey, we were talking, I don't know if you're familiar with the goings-on in Asheville, but they used to have this old Blue Ridge Liberty Project. Then there was a split between the capitalists and these people that decided they wanted to go into anarcho-primitivists. Chase, you were telling me about this nonsense while I was visiting you on Wednesday. And I mean, I thought I knew how ridiculous these primitivists were, and you were blowing my mind with some of their ideas. Give us a run, just so we can all have a good laugh. Give us a rundown of what these people believe.
Well, just like any other ideology, you'll have different factions, right? But the particular people who split off from us, they're very hardcore about it. They're very anti-technology. Pretty much any technology developed from the Bronze Age on. So if it's Stone Age technology, I think that's okay. I think that's where they draw the line. But anything above that is a no-go. They're of course opposed to capitalism. They're opposed to property. They're opposed to agriculture, even, believe it or not.
Yeah.
So they want to basically
gatherers.
Right. They want to revert society back to a hunter-gatherer society, and they are explicitly against the domestication brought on by civilization itself. So they oppose civilization, right?
And my favorite one, you said that they weren't all jumping on this idea, but there was even a couple of them that were flirting with the idea that we shouldn't even use language. We should just revert back to points.
Right, because it's a building block of civilization, right?
I'm just gonna bark at you for a couple minutes and hopefully you get it.
Yeah, so like, how are you going to explain this idea to me in the first place without using just the absurdities of these people? So I thought primitivists were some kind of, Amish or whatever, let them go do their own thing. That's fine if they want to live primitively. Like the
Amish are far more rational than these people.
But these are people that they almost believe in the Malthusian idea of like this population bomb, and they basically want to kill off the majority of the population. Of course,
Malthus is rational compared. Malthus was an actual economist who made a mistake. What you're talking about here is Rousseauian ideas of. This is Jean-Jacques Rousseau actually believed that the beginning of the corruption of humankind began with the division of labor. And private ownership of homesteads, and that if we could get rid of that, then we revert, to a better condition where we live in sort of a happy poverty without need. And if you want to go back even further than that, Saint Augustine himself was a follower of a weird prophet named Mani.
Mm-hmm. This is before he was a Christian.
Yeah, it was so-called Manichaeans, right? So the prophet was Mani, and he was a weird dude. He, of course, these guys were running around all over the place. He was particularly weirdly successful, but he divided the world up into light and dark, and the dark was the material world, and the light was the pure spirit, right? So our goal in this life was to obtain ever more, to release ourselves from materialism ever more, and to embed ourselves into the world of the spirit. Now, there's a problem because we first of all, we exist, so that's a slight problem. The other problem is that we have to eat, right? So how did Mani propose to deal with this? He said, well, there's various levels. First, you have to start with vegetarianism. He skipped recycling, but anyway, you have to be a vegetarian. It's the further you can get away from meat, the more pure you are. And his high priests in his cult had to live under trees and wait for the fruits to fall off branches because since picking a tree would be a sort of an act of violence, And so this is the way they rendered the world, the so-called Manichaeans. And if you read St. Augustine's City of God, City of Man, he's in like full-scale revolt against the Manichaeans. And he has great attacks on vegetarianism, for example, in there. And he's very much in favor of like killing animals for meat, and this is actually what set him off on a kind of a pro-civilization track. Was his brief period with the Manichaeans.
Yeah, and if you read his Confessions, he devotes a few chapters to when he was part of that period. I haven't read City of God, but I do think that's an interesting. The Manichaeans were this like heretic cult in the early days of Christianity. They had some wacko ideas, and there was a lot of these types of cults out there that St. Augustine. And you're right, Jeff. I shouldn't have thrown Malthus under the bus. At least half of his tract falling into this fallacy was picking on William Godwin, who is basically the first anarcho-communist. And his critiques of William Godwin are absolutely laudable. So I mean, he's got his own fallacies, but he's by no means. And he was the first guy to fall into the fallacy. He can be forgiven. But these primitivists fallen into this. It's not even communism for them. It's not even community ownership of property. It's that we don't own anything. We just can live around, poop in the woods, and pick berries, and that's how we have to. That's how the 10 of us that remain.
It baffles me. However, I see an anarcho-primitivist. They're talking about their progress on their projects, and they're posting it from their technology phone and using common contemporary tools. It's like, you're going to be nitpicking about all this kind of stuff you're using?
Chase, you were telling me this guy sells for profit, sells advertisements on his Facebook pages, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to. Yeah, he does, but I don't want to get sidetracked and pick on this one guy. I mean, he does his thing. It's totally irrational, but I don't want to get off topic too much.
The first and last word on not the first word, but the last word on these people was Rothbard's freedom, inequality, primitivism, and the division of labor. So just look up that monograph, and it's a brilliant, devastating destruction of sort of primitivism as an idea, which he wrote after his time in the New Left. So he had like a very intense, sort of like, damn it, what's with you people? Kind of, I'm fed up, sort of attitude,
He jumped around with a few of these groups. He had his period with the Objectivists too, and kind of had the same.
Well, he never quite left that, actually, but anyway.
But he did write Mozart is a Red, making fun of him.
Yeah.
Okay, and just so I know Jeff Peterson. We got 2 Jeffs now, so I need to start using your last names. I know Jeff Peterson and Chris. You guys, the 3 of us at least, we talk a lot about left libertarians, and I don't share the animosity. Just to give you a more positive story, so you just don't think we're picking on these guys. While we were in Asheville, Chase was gracious enough to take me to an anarchist bookstore, run mutualistically, run on, I guess, Proudhonian principles is how they would see it. Of course, it's for profit. They're making money off of it. And we had a wonderful, wonderful conversation with an anti-capitalist anarchist. It was actually one of the most pleasant conversations I've had with somebody I disagree with. So there's a lot of people in this town that are of different persuasions of anarchy, is the perception I've got, and they seem perfectly amiable, or at least some of them are perfectly amiable. And I always like seeing that, so I don't want people thinking I'm just attacking people I disagree with. But that was an interesting. I bought a book at that store, by the way, and the guy was like, "Thanks for supporting us." And all I wanted to say was, "I actually just like your book more than I like my $26. I could care less about your store." But okay, so we've gone from 3 to 5 people here. This has gotten a little chaotic. This has gotten a little anarchic. Andy has finally gotten on. Jeff Tucker's on. And Jeff Peterson, you're back on after having some connections issues, but you were trying to ask a question earlier before you got cut off. Jeff Peterson, what was that question?
Yeah, it's actually kind of relevant since you actually said that you went into a economic illiterate Proudhonian anarchist bookstore. And then what my question is that, I've gotten this argument many, many times, and this is just for all the people that out there that have gotten it too, but whenever, in regards to your book, A Capitalist Argument, for a Stateless Society, you'll get the left anarchists saying how anarchy is traditionally leftist and how they're against hierarchy, which capitalism does. Just want to know your basic thoughts. It's a basic question, but want to know what your thoughts would be on that objection from a left anarchist.
That anarchism is inherently at odds with capitalism? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, the anarchism is inherently at odds with capitalism, as well as that it's traditionally leftist.
Well, I think there's... Well, it might be traditionally leftist, but I don't think just because it's traditionally leftist that it has to be leftist, right? But I think that there's 2 parts to this this issue with capitalism. First, I think there's a semantic difference. I believe when they define capitalism, they're saying what we have right now is capitalism, what we might call cronyism, right? And the other part is that they tend to have a substantive difference, fundamental difference, especially when it comes to privately owning land and other means of production. And I think the reason that they tend to conflate issues with the state, with capitalism, is because they, for some reason, and I don't know why, they believe that to enforce a private proprietarian society requires a state to safeguard or protect property, which is the most ironic, backwards thing in my perspective, because the state is by far the #1 violator of private property rights, and it is the one thing standing in the way of having a fully expressed private proprietarian society, if you will, a capitalist society. So, Jeff, you and I, we would define capitalism as it's just that environment to where all scarce goods, including the means of production, are subject to private or exclusive ownership, given they are acquired through homesteading or voluntary exchange.
Mm.
You know, and that's a very simple, concise, concrete definition. Whereas to them, capitalism is just anything that's pissing them off that day. they don't like, it's just anything I don't like falls in this category: exploitation, domination, whatever. It's very fuzzy, very ambiguous. So I don't think it's really I think it's very rarely a rational, substantive aversion to capitalism. I think it's more of a intuitive, emotional prejudice against it. It's more of a feeling they have against it than like a rational thought. So I can't really explain a reason why they're against it, because I don't think there really is much reasoning behind it. I think it's just.
I think a lot of it has to do with, and I've spoken to Jeffrey and Chris and you about this, that I think one thing that is a driving philosophy of many of the left, not to say all of them. There's quite a few good ones like Gregory and so on. But I think a lot of it has to do with some of that capital accumulation gives the ability, just the fact that the accumulation of capital cannot be universal is the fact that people can have more is worse than is just they abhor that.
Right. If there's one thing I can say about all leftists, and I think this is really the ultimate reason that they all share, is because the idea of capitalism and free markets really goes against their #1 virtue, which is egalitarianism.
Mm.
It all goes down to egalitarianism when you come down. Go ahead. Somebody trying to.
I'm sorry, I didn't. I thought you were concluding. Did I cut you off?
No, it's fine. What did you want to say?
Oh, I actually wanted to hear Jeff Tucker's response to this, because I know, Jeffrey, you're friendly with both sides, and I've been trying to get Jeff Peterson to set me up with a left libertarian for some time to interview them, because I don't really get into this.
I think Jeff Peterson's argument here is probably directed against Kevin Carson more than anybody else.
Mm.
I may be wrong about that. I'm not sure. And really, I am not the one to speak. I mean, he's written like books this thick, and I haven't read them. I'm sorry, but the little bit of familiarity I have with this type of thinking has nothing to do with emotionalism or egalitarianism. Although, I mean, maybe in drunken Twitter flame wars it does, but this crowd has a kind of weird obsession that I don't entirely grok, but it's centered on a historical point concerning enclosure, the enclosure movement, and during the Industrial Revolution in England. I mean, you've got a situation where most all land ownership was in fact a grant by the king. And it's true in American history too. I mean, the land grants were, by the federal government were massive. The fairy tale of the Lockean, homesteading. In fact, although it's very, very beautiful on paper, has not really been the way it's historically played itself out. And I think this, if I were, in a strange sense, I think that this argument is actually in a weird way too historical and actually almost like overblown in its scholarship. It's like, they observe that certain feudal plots of land, were granted by the king, acquired through violence, in the 14th century or something, and they obsess truly about the enclosure movement and the Industrial Revolution. And they conclude from that anybody with exaggerated amounts of property today must be a pillager, And I find this to just be interesting from a historical point of view, but I don't know what it has to do with now. I mean, I don't know what else to say. I think at some point, you have to just acknowledge the titles that exist.
Right.
And as long as you're not currently using violence, I don't know why you couldn't sort of use close theorem analytics to basically deduce that, given market conditions, private property lands in the possession of those who justly own it. But let me just one second point, and it concerns something that's very valid from the left libertarians, and that this, which I must say has been woefully neglected among the right. By that I mean the Rundian Rothbardians, right? And that is the problem of intellectual property. I mean, the so-called left libertarians, this includes Kevin Carson, have been absolutely stellar on this issue of intellectual property and how patents and copyrights have been an unfair and unjust, illegitimate form of property that's accrued to the ruling class at the expense of everybody else. And to that extent, I think they have some very, very important insights. They may be exaggerated, but still, I think it's something we should pay attention to, which is one of the reasons I don't really think it's a good idea to just sort of cast out, I mean, the Peterson strategy, just cast them all into the outer beyond.
Jeff, let me jump in. You're actually breaking up a little bit. I think I got everything you said, but it was a little choppy.
Yeah, Chris, I'd like to say something too, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I do think the left libertarians are pretty good at IP. However, I don't think the position against intellectual property is necessarily a left libertarian one, like a leftist one. It's not one that's unique to left libertarianism, I should say. I mean, as you know, people like Kinsella are very anti-IP. I'm anti-IP, very much so. I know most ANCAPs I know are anti-IP.
One of the things that we brought up is Rothbard's view on copyrights was actually, he said no patents, but yes, copyrights. Copyrights are a product of common law, and you and I actually debated that. So I'm not as anti-IP as long as it's a product of common law as a lot of libertarians that come in. I want to hear your thoughts on that. Sorry, I thought that was implied.
Whose thoughts do you hear?
Your thoughts, Chase. Sorry.
Oh, on intellectual property?
Yeah.
Oh well, I mean, to me, it's not about a common law. It's about like does it comport with the private property ethic, with the principles which underlie the anarcho-capitalist or libertarian philosophy. And to me, it's very clear that our proprietarian views regard scarce goods. It all centers around scarcity, right? And patterns of information or things that could be, infinitely copyable without denigrating the quality of the original or anything of this. Any sort of just configuration of information itself is not something that you can rightfully lay a monopolistic claim to, absent some sort of binding contract you have with some other individual. It's not something that you don't have inherently a monopolistic right to just a certain set of patterns of information just because you may have been the first person to think of that particular configuration. Because in order to exercise, whether it's a copyright or a patent or a trademark, whatever have you, in order to exercise it would entail an abridgment of other people's private property rights to their own scarce goods. And it's because that they can't logically be reconciled that we need to favor the property rights to scarce goods over the property rights into what's ever considered intellectual property. So to me, it's a very principle-based opposition. Whatever common law comes up with, maybe it comes up with things which favor IP-type things, but just because it comes up through common law mechanisms doesn't mean that it comports with our libertarian theory of justice, if you will.
Yeah, so that's an area in which you're going to agree with the left libertarians, and of course there's a lot of those areas, I think.
Yeah, I just don't think I don't think it's unique to left libertarianism to be against IP, is what I'm trying to say.
Right. Looks like Jeffrey Tucker left. So, well, I was going to bring up. I was glad to hear what he said about property and what they, what they're looking at the Industrial Revolution, which if any of you study that, it really is easy to see where left libertarian comes from, because property is a product of government at that time, and their critiques had some logic to them. We have the benefit of knowing what those fallacies were, and I think that's what bothers me about the left libertarians today is they should know better on these fallacies. Whereas, P.J. Proudhon didn't have that benefit. He was coming from a monarchical society where all property was granted by the grace of the divine king. So I think that's a good answer to that. Andy, you had a question. I want to see what you had to say for Chase.
Sure. Yeah. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah, sorry for the coming in late, but yeah, I kind of wanted to come back to the topic of the peaceful parenting and the non-aggression and the family in general. And I think one area of debate or one area of study that I think has been neglected is like the whole concept of abortion and how does that square within the private property ethic and the non-aggression. I really enjoyed what you had to say about I have 2 kids and one's 4, one's 2, and hitting them or doing anything abusive or more aggressive to invoke aggression is just beyond the pale. And I kind of consider myself really more of a pro-life person as well. So I just wondered if I doubt your book probably goes into that at all, but I wondered if you had some thoughts on how that maybe, if you had any thoughts or writings on abortion.
You can extrapolate from my book my answer on this, and my position on abortion is, I think it's a pretty unique one, and one that people are either afraid to make explicit or they just maybe haven't thought of. So just prefacing it, personally, disclaimer, personally I'm against abortions. Like I don't think they're crimes. I don't think they're NAP violations, but I oppose them as a personal preference, right? I think it's an unsavory practice. However, to me, it goes back to moral agency. And I talk about moral agency in the book and what the criteria for moral agent. And what a moral agent is just someone to where rights are applicable to. And in order to attain the status of moral agent to where you have rights, at the bare minimum, and this is why I state in my book, you have to have at least the capacity to recognize and deliberately respect the rights of others, because rights are reciprocal. It's a reciprocal relationship you have with other beings, rational beings. Like we wouldn't say, for instance, that a bear, if a bear mauls somebody, we wouldn't say he murdered that guy. That bear murdered. No, he killed him. He didn't murder him. There's no ethical content to it. This bear doesn't recognize and understand. So with respect to bears, we have no rights. And with respect, and so to bears, we have no rights, and to us, bears have no rights. So it's symmetrical. We don't expect bears to respect our rights. They don't expect us to respect theirs, because it's not even something that gets brought up, because they have no conception of rights to begin with. So when it comes to abortion, a fetus is not a moral agent. It has absolutely no capacity to recognize or deliberately respect rights. And so from a purely strictly legal perspective, rights aren't applicable to it. Now, can we use social and economic pressures and appeal to a sense of morality which is far more broad than a narrow libertarian legal sense? Of course, and I think we should. But strictly libertarian legal theory speaking, no, it's not. It's whether it's alive or not is beside the point. What's relevant is it's a moral agent, and no, it's clearly not. So, yeah, in that narrow sense, I'm pro-choice from a legal perspective, but pro-life from a personal preference perspective, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
Where I'm stuck on abortion is that, for instance, if I think I read I saw a post that in Ireland that abortion is illegal now. You can make it illegal, but that could push it underground. I haven't studied abortion as much in a stateless capitalist society, but with making it illegal, I'm not even sure how that would be applied. But how wouldn't that have a consequence of pushing into more of a black market, so to speak, in a stateless society?
Yeah, but I think you're getting into more of the less interesting consequentialist perspective. I think the real interesting part of this question is the theoretical ethical question. Like, in theory, is abortion an NAP violation or not? And I don't think it is. I don't. And I think that I can defend that position pretty consistently. And it's for the same reason I don't think abortion is legal. I don't think animals have rights.
Well,
And
one quick question about the moral agent question. So,
Sure.
at what point does a human or become a moral agent? Like, would it be like after after birth, like after it leaves the womb, or is it
Oh,
some?
certainly. It would definitely be after birth, right? And again, there's some shocking extrapolations you can make from that. Well, so you're saying that parents could legally murder their infants? Well, yeah, technically, sure, but I mean, we obviously have very strict and strong social and economic pressures in place that would totally be some severe consequences for that. And when we talk about rights and whether or not something is legal or not, what we're really saying is, would it be justified in response to this particular act for us to employ physical force against the person or property of the person who perpetrated that act? That's all it implies.
Sure.
Anything outside of using violence against this person or their property will be totally cool to deter such activities. So yeah, moral agency is acquired as soon as that person, it doesn't matter what age they are, as soon as they are able to at least have the capacity to recognize and deliberately respect the rights of others. Because it has to be a reciprocal, rights are a reciprocal relationship. They have to be.
I think it's an interesting answer. That's something I always go back and forth on. I think you responded to a post that I made a while back where I said almost the same thing Andy did. I am morally pro-life, but politically I guess I'm pro-choice, and I like the way you put that.
I totally, I mean, we might have some disagreements, and this topic is much more than a 10-minute, 30-minute conversation. So I enjoyed your response, and it's probably a difficult question, like on the spot. But I think the one thing, and it's interesting. The reason I was going to bring this up is because I know Jeffrey and Stefan have talked about this. I know that Hoppa has talked about this as well. Is that if there really, it's like who has the best ownership claim to said, whether it's an entity that's in trust for a certain time.
Yeah.
But if anything, it would be like a parent or some type of a hereditary link. If it's, let's say my wife and I, or let me say this wouldn't happen. Somebody else in my family was thinking about having an abortion. Who would it be, like their parent or a grandparent or somebody that said, hey, I'll adopt that child if you bring it to term? Like they would have like a bit more of a claim to that, person than say, or that child or non-moral agent, what you want to call it, versus like some, person that's crying down the street about, we need to make abortions illegal. So I think that's an interesting thing. I'm not sure if you've thought about that at all. So. But that was all I had.
Cool. Yeah, I don't address that topic explicitly in the book, but I do talk about moral agency and the criteria for it. And when I bring it up, I use the animal rights issue to show why well, at least most animals that we know of, don't have rights. So.
We actually spoke about that the other day with a lefty about how animals aren't moral agents and how the NAP doesn't necessarily apply to them. So,
right.
Remember that.
So to wrap that up, what you're saying, Chase, is reciprocity is a necessary component of, I guess, the non-aggression principle?
Yeah, and only in the sense that at the very least, you have to be able to at least recognize what rights are and to be able to deliberately respect them. Because let's say that you didn't know what rights were, you had no conception whatsoever, because you didn't have the capacity to even have that conception. Mm-hmm. Well, for me for you to attempt to have me respect your rights, whereas you have no conception of them, so I can't, so you can't respect mine. That is to put you in a position of moral superiority over me. Like, let's take a wasp or a bee, for example. To say that you can't initiate force against that bee, and if you do, there's going to be some legal consequences, and you're going to be said to be having commit a criminal act. But then that bee can initiate force against me, but it's not considered a crime. Well, that puts that bee in a position of moral superiority. Whereas if I say the bee doesn't have any rights, we're on the same footing now. With respect to the bee, I have no rights. with respect to me, the bee has no rights.
Mhm.
It's all symmetric. It's all about that kind of a symmetrical relationship. That's kind of the essence of justice.
Right. Okay, I like that. I'm glad we closed up on that. We need to wrap up a little bit. We're coming to the top of
Sure.
the hour. This was definitely and I've got one final question for you, Chase, of course, before we wrap up, and you already know what that is. But this has definitely been one of the more interesting talks. I came into this thinking we were going to have 3 people. We've had connection issues with almost all of us. So this has been one of the more chaotic interviews I've done, but I think that made it a little bit more entertaining for those of y'all who stuck with us. All right. The last question that I ask every guest, Chase, is I want you to make a book recommendation. Now, of course, everybody needs to go out. You can go on Amazon.com and buy a spontaneous order, or you can go to the Mises' website and get a PDF of it for free. So there's no excuses not to read this book.
Or you can buddy up with Chris and just beg him to send you a free copy for Christmas.
Exactly. But you're not allowed to recommend your own book. So I want you to recommend, if you could only give us one book to read that's not yours, what would it be?
I'd have to say the Ethics and Economics of Private Property by Hoppe.
I knew it was going to be a Hoppe book.
Yeah.
I didn't know which one. I haven't read that one, but I'll definitely add that to my list. All right. Chase, thank you for having us, or thank you for coming on the show. Good God, I can't even talk tonight myself. We will be back in a few weeks. We're no longer doing weekly episodes if you guys haven't picked up on that, but we will be back soon enough. So stay tuned, and until the next time, y'all have a nice night.
Adios.